Bobby Shafto's gone to see silver buckles at his knee, the latest fashion accessory from Bonnie Bobby Shafto. Now Bobby's working for the crown, paid in sovereigns and in pounds, to make an execution gown from Bonnie Bobby Shafto. Chapter 12. Elsbeth's newly formed curls bounced as she walked, and she felt as though she wore a hat covered in springs, a sensation she was not sure she liked. One of the curls fell to the middle of her forehead, and she brushed it into place once more. As the pale-skinned ladies-in-waiting, whom Elsbeth learned were named Catherine and Jane, escorted her down the long corridor toward the great hall, she made idle chit-chat about the weather as a means of covering up the increasingly loud protests from her empty stomach. The dress, being so snug around her midsection, did nothing to help matters. Bobby Shafto may have been the most fashionable designer in the kingdom, but even he could not properly fit a dress without exact measurements. Her stomach groaned again, and this time the squeak of the door at the end of the hallway covered it up somewhat. Jane pulled the door open, presenting Elsbeth with a view of a large rectangular room with ceilings 30 feet high. At the far end was a fireplace in which fat, dry logs crackled in the busy flames. The sound mingled with the murmur of villagers by the dozens filling in from several doors placed around the perimeter of the room. Narrow wooden tables lined each length of the great hall and were pushed end to end, giving the appearance of two singularly long tables. While the people trickled in and took their seats upon hard wooden benches, Elsbeth was escorted along the smooth marble floor to one of only 3 chairs in the entire room. While 2 of the chairs were rather ordinary, the one in the center was high-backed and ornate with a dark blue velvet seat. She assumed this must be reserved for the king, and realized that if this were true, she'd be sitting right next to the man himself. Just as the last guest took a seat, a set of wide double doors opposite the fireplace swung open, and in walked the same 4 bearded men who had escorted Elsbeth to the castle. With those same long spears in hand, they took position, standing at attention, 2 to each side of the door. Right on their heels, the 2 other men entered, holding polished brass trumpets. They moved to the center of the room, raised the instruments to their lips, and blasted out a short and sudden tune. Doo-doo-doo-doo! The moment they finished, the men lowered the horns as Georgie, in his ascot and epaulettes, strode into the room and said in a loud voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, all rise for His Highness, King Cruel, ruler of all the land, Lord of the seas and the moon, Duke of Banbury Cross, Baron of Gotham, Royal Knight Companion of the most noble order of silver bells and cockleshells, Earl of St. Ives, Great Steward of the Pumpkin Eaters, Knight Grand Cross of the most honorable order of Knick-Knack Paddywhack, and Royal Grand Champion of the Order of Pickled Peppers." When he swept in through the doors, the first thing Elsbeth noticed about the king was the same thing most people notice about him at first glance. He was tall and slim, especially for someone so fond of pudding and pie, with an unreasonably handsome face. His jaw was sharp and angular, ending in a prominent chin, dimpled at the center. His smile was broad and easy, with teeth so straight and white that from this distance they appeared, like the tables in the room, to be one continuous thing, a solitary piece of pure white enamel. This made Elsbeth think about the gap between her own teeth, and she made a mental note that when smiling in his presence, she must always do so with lips pursed. The trumpeters reprised their tune as the king walked with a slow and measured grace toward his royal chair, with Georgie and the 4 guards following at the required minimum distance of 6 feet. The king's royal subjects stood and gazed upon the man with placid smiles. Though Elsbeth normally held little or no regard for figures of authority, there was something different going on here. And when the king looked at Elsbeth, her heart stopped for a moment. When the king reached his chair, Georgie quickly slid the throne back from the table. Before taking his place upon it, the king faced the table at the opposite side of the room, stretched his arms out to their full span, and said in a smooth and commanding voice, "Let the feast begin." Cheering and applause filled the hall, and the door from the kitchen burst open. In filed servants, one after the other, carrying platter upon platter of all the foods that had contributed to that wonderful smell Elsbeth noticed when she first arrived at the castle. As 4 women pushed a squeaky-wheeled table carrying the every-berry pie toward the center of the room, the king turned to his guest of honor and said, "Ms. Pule, welcome to my home." "Thank you," she said, parting her lips just enough to let the words out. The king offered his hand, and Elsbeth reached out to shake it. Instead, the king took her hand in his, leaned forward, and touched it gently to his lips, pulpy and perfectly shaped. Please sit down." Then he flashed those flawless teeth, and Elsbeth returned the smile with lips pinched tightly together. Sitting in the VIP section had its perks, not the least of which was first crack at the food. No sooner had Elsbeth sat down than one of the servants placed a plate before her, loaded with enough food to make Thanksgiving dinner look like a bedtime snack. And though the plate did contain several vegetables, braised carrots, Brussels sprouts, and mashed potatoes, it also featured things that Elsbeth considered far more edible, things like honey-glazed ham and roasted rack of lamb, which made Elsbeth think of Bo Peep, but only for a moment, and not in any way that would suggest empathy. "You must try the ham," said the king, taking a bite. "It looks delicious," said Elsbeth. "Let's just say it's a good thing this little piggy went to market," said the king. Georgie, sitting to his right, offered a courtesy chuckle, while Elsbeth went to work on the enormous plate of food. Even on the best of occasions, her table manners were no better than her manners in general. And now, with her stomach clamoring for food, she nearly forgot them entirely, stuffing her face with one forkful after another. "Yes, you must be hungry after your long journey," said the king, as he watched Elsbeth with mild shock. Elsbeth offered a grunt of affirmation while continuing to gulp down food with minimal chewing. "I'm sorry to have kept you waiting, but my physical therapy session went longer than expected. You see, I wrenched my back on the golf course today while trying to get out of a sand trap. It's not easy being king, but somebody's got to do it." Georgie gave out another courtesy laugh, which the king once more failed to acknowledge. "Make sure you save room for the cheese course," the king said to Elsbeth. "It's one of my many culinary weaknesses, I must admit." "I like grilled cheese," Elsbeth responded. Said the king, seemingly unimpressed. "If you're not into fine cheeses, you must save room for dessert. It's every berry pie, my personal favorite. Contains every berry there is." Elsbeth fought back a smirk. "Don't be so sure," she thought of saying, until she noticed Georgie leaning back and staring daggers at her. So instead she said, "My mother doesn't bake pie. It's not her thing." "Ah, yes, your mother," said the king, as if he and Mrs. Pewell had gone to high school together or something. "I'm sure you're anxious to see her again after all this time." "It hasn't been that long," said Elsbeth. "But yeah, I guess I would like to see her again." "You needn't worry, because that's going to happen much sooner than you know. I promise you that." "Thanks," said Elsbeth. "I knew you'd help me out." "So then," said Cruel, "tell me about your journey. How was it?" "Not great," Elsbeth admitted. "Met a bunch of kooks. Almost got killed by something called a torcano." "Yes," said the king. "It's the season. For torcanos, that is. Not kooks, as you call them. You'll find plenty of those year-round, I'm afraid. Not anywhere near here, mind you. One of my very first proclamations as king, I'm proud to say, was to banish all of the pathetic, whiny little losers to the outskirts where they belong." Elsbeth took this as a compliment. At school, with her gapped teeth and pudgy face and arms, she often felt both unattractive and, as a result, banished from the legions of the handsome and the popular. And now here she was, for the very first time in her life, invited to be part of the fashionable crowd. "So tell me," the king said, leaning closer to Elsbeth, "what do they say about me? These kooks you meet." Said Elsbeth, giving careful consideration to her answer. "Well, they say you have your own bowling alley." "Do you enjoy bowling?" the king asked. "Oh, yes," said Elsbeth, "very much." She hoped an enthusiastic response would lead to an invitation to play. "I'm sure they say a great deal more about me than that," said the king. "I guess," said Elsbeth. "Such as?" "Oh, you know, the usual, about all the great stuff you've done." "No insults or threats?" "Oh, no," Elsbeth lied, for she saw no reason to mention all the horrible stories Dumpty and his friends had told her about the king. After all, what could they possibly say? The king smiled contentedly. "Good. Then all is in order, it seems." He then turned to Georgie and said, "The time has come." The king stood and raised his own glass to eye level. "I would like to propose a toast," he began, "to our esteemed guest, Ms. Elsbeth Pewell." Elsbeth was now aware that everyone in the room was staring at her, and at the same time she was completely unaware that her left cheek was smudged with gravy. Quickly she cast her eyes downward and stopped chewing for a moment. Even though she was feeling, for the first time in her life, quite attractive, dressed in a beautiful silk gown with her hair done up in curls, Elsbeth did not like being stared at, and she hoped this toast would not be a long-winded one, like the kind her father sometimes made when he'd had more than one glass of wine. She is a remarkably resilient young lady, the king continued, and she has grown great courage, incredible intelligence, and extraordinary wisdom in choosing to make the very long and very dangerous journey from her home to the castle in order to be with us this evening to turn herself in. Hear, hear! Hear, hear, the crowd repeated, while Elsbeth nearly choked on her food before spitting the entire mouthful onto her plate. The king took his seat and resumed eating as if he'd just announced the time of day and nothing more. "Excuse me, your highness," Elsbeth said while tugging at the king's sleeve. "I'm sorry, but what did you mean by that? That I came here to turn myself in?" "That is why you're here, isn't it?" the king answered with a warm, almost fatherly smile. "To turn yourself in?" "To turn myself into what?" "Not into what? Into whom?" "Into my authority, to face the consequences for your crimes." "Crimes? Hey, that sign told me to take that tart without paying for it." "You stole a tart as well?" said the king. And then just like that, his once kind and handsome face changed. His eyes narrowed and his lips and eyebrows turned sharply downward as if gravity had suddenly taken a special interest in them. "I will consider that a full confession, and I will be sure to add it to the list of charges." "What list? I haven't done anything," Elsbeth protested. As much as she despised having to take responsibility for things she'd actually done, being forced to own up to things she hadn't done made her absolutely livid. "Haven't done anything?" the king repeated, sounding almost insulted by Elsbeth's denial. "You and your family have been plotting my demise for years, and now you will finally pay the price." "My family? Okay, now this is getting weird," said Elsbeth, without stopping to think about how ridiculous a statement that was, being that things had been getting weird for the better part of a day now. "My family knows nothing about this place. Everyone here has obviously mistaken me for someone else." "I think not," sneered the king. The murmur of conversation throughout the room and the scraping of flatware on china ceased. The king pushed his face toward Elsbeth, and she scooted back to the far edge of her chair. "It is without a doubt that you are the one about whom it is written." "Okay, here we go again with all this it is written stuff," said Elsbeth. "What? What is written?" "The foretelling of your treasonous and seditious acts," replied the king. "All right, I don't know what seditious means," said Elsbeth, "but I do know what treason is. It's betraying your country, which I could not possibly do because this is not my country. I've never been here before." "Haven't you?" said the king with a smile that was no longer warm in any way. "No, I haven't," Elsbeth answered quite emphatically. "I only came to the castle to find the way out of this miserable country of yours." Elsbeth pushed her chair back and stood up. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going home, with or without your help." "Silly girl," said the king with a laugh and a shake of his head. "I said that I would see to it that you and your mother were soon reunited. I never said I'd help you find your way home. That's because you are home." "You're crazy," said Elsbeth. "You're all crazy. This whole place. Now, I need to speak with Jack and Jill immediately, so if somebody could show me to the dungeon." "Don't worry," the king responded. "Someone will be more than happy to show you to the dungeon." Then he turned to the 4 bearded men standing behind him and said, "Take her to the dungeon to await trial on charges of treason, sedition, and grand theft tart." Almost immediately, Elsbeth found herself in the clutches of 2 of the men, while the other 2 opened the nearest doors. "Hey!" she screamed. "Take your hands off me!" Not only did the men not remove their hands from her chubby arms, they began dragging her toward the open door. "You can't do this to me," she said, kicking her legs and stomping her feet. "I'm an American citizen. I know my rights. I demand to speak with a lawyer." She managed to crane her neck far enough to find Georgie, who looked a bit traumatized by the whole ordeal. "You!" she shouted. "You led me to believe this was a feast in my honor." "I'm sorry," Georgie mumbled. "I had no idea." "Quiet!" the king shouted. "You're apologizing to a known enemy of the crown." To the beefy guards, who seemed to be having far too much trouble subduing an 11-year-old girl, he said, "Now, get her out of my sight." When the 4 men hauled her through the door, and just before they slammed it shut, Elsbeth hollered, "Dumpty was right. You're a horrible person. And another thing, that pie has no loganberries." We'll work for food. Old King Cruel was a nasty old fool, and a nasty old fool was he. He called for his pipe, and he called for his bowl, and he called for the cancellation of all federal holidays, including Christmas, Easter, and St. Crispin's Day. and the execution of all enemies of the crown, both foreign and domestic, including but not limited to his Fiddlers 3.